I was 69 years old when everything in my life shifted so violently that even now I still struggle to understand how I survived those days. Before I continue, welcome to my story. I share pieces of my life here, and if you stay until the end, I promise you will hear something you will never forget. My name is Aloan Sharp, and because of my daughter, I was working every day at an age when most people were slowing down, resting, or being gently cared for by the ones they had raised. But my life had followed a different path, one filled with debt, disappointment, and quiet heartbreak. I had not always imagined a future like this. When I was younger, I dreamed of a peaceful home, a warm kitchen filled with laughter, and a daughter who would grow beside me with kindness in her heart. Instead, I raised Maribel, a brilliant yet restless girl whose eyes always seemed to search for something beyond what I could give. By the time she was a teenager, she began slipping away from me step by step, decision by decision, until one day I realized she no longer saw me as a mother, but as an obstacle she needed to push aside. Even then I tried to hold her close, tried to believe that one day she would turn around and see me standing there with open arms, ready to forgive anything. But life has its own sharp ways of teaching us truths we do not want to learn. When Maribel turned 40, buried in debts I knew nothing about, she came to me with a trembling voice and asked if I could help her, just until she got back on her feet. And because I was a mother before anything else, I said yes. I took on long hours at a bakery, then at a laundromat, then finally at a small diner where the scent of frying onions followed me everywhere I went. The diner became my second home, though home is a generous word for a place where I spent most of my hours sweating over simmering pots while my back throbbed like an old engine refusing to die. The customers barely noticed me, the young employees pitied me, and Maribel visited only when she needed more money. She always promised she would pay me back, always swore things were getting better, and I always believed her because believing her was the only comfort I had left. But as the months rolled on, my savings shrank, my energy thinned, and I began to wonder how much longer my body could keep carrying the weight of her troubles. I rented a room in an old boarding house run by a woman named Thalia Crestwood, who had a voice like cracked porcelain and a stare that saw right through every excuse. The room was small, the mattress thin, and the walls so fragile that I could hear every cough from the neighbor next door. Still, it was all I could afford. I told myself it was temporary, just until Maribel stabilized, just until my bones stopped aching long enough for me to think clearly again. But the truth was simpler and crueler. I stayed because leaving required strength I no longer possessed, and because hope, even thin hope, is the hardest thing to abandon. Every night when I returned from the diner, I would collapse on the creaking mattress, rubbing my hands that shook with exhaustion, telling myself I was doing this for Maribel because motherhood does not end when children grow old. It simply changes shape, becomes quieter, heavier. But I also knew something was shifting inside me, a quiet alarm ringing in the deepest part of my chest. I began waking at odd hours, sensing movement in the hallway or hearing whispers that vanished the moment I opened my door. I told myself it was the building settling or my imagination running wild, but a knot of unease was forming, slow and stubborn. Then came the night that would fracture the fragile rhythm of my days. I returned late from the diner, the streets damp from a thin rain that made the neon lights blur like fading memories. When I unlocked my door, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, a thickness that settled in my lungs the moment I stepped inside. At first I blamed the humidity, the old building, even my own fatigue, but as I moved deeper into the room, a faint hiss reached my ears. It was so soft I thought it was the radiator, yet something in me froze because the sound felt wrong, foreign, dangerous. I approached the small heater mounted near the corner, my breath shallow, my pulse tapping against my throat like a trapped bird. The hiss grew louder as I neared it, and suddenly the truth snapped into place, so violently that I stumbled back against the wall. Gas, raw, invisible, waiting. I felt the room spin as I imagined what could have happened if I had fallen asleep, if I'd struck a match, if one spark from the faulty hallway light had found its way inside. I forced myself to open the window, my fingers trembling as the night air rushed in, cold and saving. I stood there gripping the frame, trying to steady my breath as the danger seeped out into the night. But as the air cleared, a new fear took its place. sharper and more personal than the threat of the gas itself. Someone had opened that valve. Someone had waited for me to return to this room, exhausted and unaware. Someone wanted me silent, gone, erased. And for the first time in my life, the thought of Maribel flickered through my mind, not as a daughter in need, but as a woman capable of choices I had never dared to imagine. I whispered her name into the darkness and felt my heart quake. I did not sleep that night, not truly, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faint shimmer of that deadly gas drifting through my room like a ghost waiting for my last breath, and the thought that someone had intended for me to inhale it hollowed me. I sat on the uneven floorboards listening to the distant hum of traffic outside and wondering how many moments of my life had already slipped past unnoticed while I worked myself raw for a daughter who barely remembered to ask if I had eaten that day in those quiet hours. When dawn finally crept across the cracked window pane, I felt older than my years, as though the night had carved new lines into my spirit, and I realized I could no longer ignore the unease that had been trailing me like a silent shadow for weeks, and it frightened me. I walked downstairs to find Thalia sorting mail with her usual stern expression, but when she looked up and saw my face, her brows knitted together, and she asked if something had happened, though her tone carried the wary distance of someone bracing for an answer they feared to hear. I opened my mouth to speak, but the memory of that hiss filled my throat with a grit of terror, and instead of explaining the danger, I simply asked whether anyone had been near my room the previous evening. Though even as the words left me, I sensed she already. Thalia shifted her weight and said she had heard footsteps late at night, but assumed they belonged to the tenant in the next room, a man named Corvin, who moved with the restless energy of someone carrying secrets tangled like vines around his conscience, yet something in her voice trembled slightly. I thanked her with a weak nod, then stepped outside into the pale morning light, because staying inside those walls felt like trying to breathe through cloth, and every instinct in me screamed that I needed to move to think, to find a place where my thoughts could settle without. I walked to the diner earlier than usual, arriving before the clatter of dishes or the rumble of deliveries, and when I unlocked the back door, the familiar scent of yeast and burnt coffee wrapped around me like a tired embrace, reminding me that this place had become my refuge. As I scrubbed the counters and prepared the morning batter, my thoughts kept circling back to Maribel, to the strange tension in her voice the last time she visited, to the sharpness in her eyes when she asked whether I had finally considered selling the small plot my mother left. At the time, I thought she was simply frustrated by her finances, but now the memory throbbed inside me with a new meaning. And as the minutes passed, I felt my resolve tightening because I knew I could no longer dismiss the possibility that my own daughter might wish me. The thought carved through me with a coldness I had never known, yet even as fear tightened around my ribs, I felt something steadier rising beneath it, a quiet determination born from years of enduring sorrow without surrender, and I knew I needed to uncover the truth, no matter the. When Mr. Latham arrived to open the diner, he paused when he saw the look on my face, the kind of pause that comes from recognizing another person's private storm. And though he asked nothing, I sensed he was quietly worried, yet I could not share the danger with. I finished my shift moving like someone half present, carrying plates and wiping tables while my mind drifted to every strange moment of the past month, every unanswered call from Maribel, every time she avoided meeting my eyes as though afraid I might see the desperation hiding behind her. By the time I stepped back into the street, the sky had dimmed to a fading copper, and the air smelled of cooling asphalt, and I knew I could not return to my room that night, because even though the gas had dispersed the fear of what awaited me there, I walked without direction until I reached the small public garden near the river, where elderly men played chess beneath lanterns, and young mothers rocked their babies, and for a moment I wished I could step into any of their lives anywhere but the fragile place mine had become now. As I sat on a cold bench, I felt the weight of my years settle around me like a heavy shawl, and I wondered when exactly I had stopped living for myself and started living only for Maribel's needs, her troubles, her endless hunger for a stability I could never. The ache in my chest deepened, but with it came a steely clarity, and I realized that if I remained silent, I would be swallowed by whatever force was closing in on me, so I decided I needed to confront Maribel face to face and hear the truth from her. I made my way to the bus stop with trembling hands, clutching my worn purse as though it could shield me from disappointment. And when the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and sat near the back where the lights flickered softly, reminding me of the fragility of everything I. As the bus rolled through the city, I watched reflections slide across the window like shifting memories, and I forced myself to breathe slowly because panic would not help me now, not when the truth waited, just 2 stops away in the apartment where Maribel had built her uneasy. When I finally stepped off the bus, the street was quiet except for the distant wail of a siren, and as I approached Maribel's building, my heartbeat quickened, not from fear alone, but from the faint, desperate hope that maybe she would look at me and choose honesty over whatever. I approached the stairwell with a heaviness pressing against my ribs, a weight made of dread and exhaustion, and the strange numbness that had wrapped itself around me ever since the superintendent mentioned that someone had reported a strange odor near my room. I had been working every single day for months, sometimes double shifts, sometimes covering for people half my age who claimed their legs hurt or their backs ached. And all of it because my daughter, Clarice, insisted she needed the help, insisted that her therapy bills were drowning her, insisted that without me she would spiral again. I never questioned her because mothers don't question daughters who cry when they ask for money. Mothers don't pause to calculate whether they are being drained drop by drop. They just give and give until their bones feel hollow. The hallway was dim as I reached the landing, the bulb buzzing the way it always did when winter crept in and the wiring contracted in the cold. My room was the 3rd door on the left, and even from several feet away I felt something off, something sharper in the air, something that made the back of my throat prickle as though tiny needles drifted inside each breath. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just the cleaning chemicals the superintendent sometimes used, but this was different. This had a metallic edge mixed with something sour, something that didn't belong. I set my grocery bag down on the floor, the apples rolling gently inside as though they too sensed something was wrong, and I leaned forward, trying to understand what my body was picking up before my mind could name it. There it was, faint but undeniable, a smell that reminded me of the time a stove malfunctioned in the diner where I worked as a teenager. The hiss that followed, the panic that erupted, the sudden rush of everyone trying to shut things off before something exploded. I swallowed hard and reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze just before touching it because instinct screamed that something wasn't right. Instinct whispered that turning that knob might be the last thing I ever did. I stepped back and forced myself to breathe through my mouth, even though every breath tasted stale and sharp. And I leaned in just enough to listen. There was no sound from inside, no movement, no sign that anything living occupied that space, which should have comforted me but instead made the air feel heavier. I remembered the superintendent's voice earlier that day, casual but curious as he mentioned that someone had complained of a strange odor on my floor. I hadn't thought much about it then because I was rushing to my evening shift, but now the memory resurfaced with a sense of urgency. I glanced down the hallway, wondering whether I should go find him, but he had left early to visit his sister, and no one else was around at this hour because most of the tenants work late or kept to themselves behind locked doors. The quiet was unsettling, the kind that presses against your ears until you hear your own pulse louder than anything else. I backed away slowly, unsure of what step to take next, my mind cycling through possibilities that grew darker with each passing second. Clarice had borrowed money again that week, had called me crying about her overdue rent, had promised she would pay me back soon, promises I no longer believed but still accepted. I didn't want to think she could be involved in anything dangerous, but a small tremor of doubt flickered inside me, uninvited and unwelcome. Still, I pushed it away because suspicion felt like betrayal, and I wasn't ready to face what it would mean if my daughter had allowed my life to fray while she continued to rely on me. I crouched to grab my grocery bag, intending to head back downstairs and ask for help, but just as I lifted it, the hallway light flickered again, casting a jittery shadow across my door as though someone stood behind it. I waited. I didn't move for several seconds, frozen in that narrow hallway with my heart pounding so loudly it felt like the entire building could hear it, and part of me wondered if fear itself made the shadows shift, or if someone truly stood on the other side of that door, waiting, listening, calculating something I couldn't yet understand. I forced myself to straighten up because crouching made me feel too vulnerable, too exposed, and I tried to steady my breathing even though each inhale sliced against my throat with the faint chemical sting still floating in the air. I stared at the door, at the chipped paint around the frame, at the dent near the bottom from the time I accidentally kicked it while carrying my laundry basket, and for a moment I felt absurdly nostalgic for the days when my biggest problem had been aching knees after a long shift, back before the strange smells and the worry and the slow creeping suspicion that my life had begun to tilt in a direction I didn't recognize. I clutched the grocery bag tighter and took a single step backward, bracing myself against the opposite wall because the floor felt slightly unsteady beneath my feet. My mind kept replaying memories of Clarice. Her tearful phone calls, her endless needs, the way she always made me feel guilty if I hesitated even for a moment before agreeing to help her. And although I didn't want to connect those memories to the danger lingering in front of me, the connection formed anyway, thin as spider silk but impossible to shake. I reached into my coat pocket for my phone, but my hands were shaking so much that I nearly dropped it, and I whispered to myself to calm down even though the words sounded hollow, even though calming down felt impossible. I typed out a quick message to the superintendent asking if he had noticed the smell again, or if anyone had been on our floor recently, but the message hung unsent for a moment because my signal was weak inside the thick concrete walls. I lifted the phone higher, stepping closer to the hallway window, hoping it would send, and after a few tense seconds the little arrow finally disappeared, leaving me waiting, hoping he would respond quickly. While I waited, I stared out the window onto the street below where cars rolled by without any awareness of the panic simmering in my chest. People walked, laughed, carried their groceries, went about their lives, and I wondered whether anyone looking up at the building would suspect that on the third floor, a woman stood afraid to enter her own room, unsure whether the danger came from an accident or from something deliberately orchestrated. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me jump, and I fumbled with the screen before opening the superintendent's reply. He said he hadn't smelled anything that morning, but had gotten another complaint during the afternoon. A tenant claiming something felt off in the hallway, though they hadn't been able to describe it clearly. He wrote that he would check it out first thing in the morning because he was already out of town and couldn't come back tonight. The message did nothing to settle my nerves. I typed back quickly, telling him I was smelling something strong near my room, that it didn't feel safe, that I thought it might be gas, and after a long pause he responded, telling me to leave the building immediately and call emergency services. My pulse kicked into overdrive. I grabbed my grocery bag and started toward the staircase with quick but careful steps, terrified of creating a spark somehow, terrified of breathing too deeply, terrified of every tiny noise I made as though it might set something off. Halfway to the stairs, I froze again because another thought crashed into me with the force of a wave. If there was a gas leak, how had it happened? And more importantly, why had it happened specifically in my room? I didn't have much, only the basics, and my stove was old but functional. I always double-checked the knobs before leaving for work because I had lived through enough years to know how quickly accidents happened when you didn't pay attention. So how could it be leaking now? I tried to shake the question out of my mind because the priority was to get out, but it clung to me stubbornly, refusing to let go. I moved again, faster this time, gripping the railing as I descended the stairs, feeling the cool metal under my hand grounding me in reality. When I reached the lobby, my breath came out shaky, and I pushed open the front door, stepping out into the cold night air as though surfacing from underwater. Only once the fresh air filled my lungs did I realize how tense my body had been. Every muscle wound tight like a coiled spring. I stood there on the sidewalk, clutching my groceries, looking up at the windows of my building, wondering if I had narrowly escaped something disastrous. I dialed the emergency line with trembling fingers, and when the operator answered, I explained the situation, my voice wavering as I tried to sound composed. She told me to stay outside, assured me help was on the way, and I nodded even though she couldn't see me, grateful simply to hear a calm voice guiding me. As I waited, I noticed a figure across the street leaning against the lamppost, tall, bundled up in a dark coat, head down as though checking something on a phone. At first I thought nothing of it. People stood outside all the time. but then the figure looked up directly at me, not at the building, not at the street, but at me, specifically, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I blinked, taken aback, and the figure immediately turned and walked briskly down the block, disappearing behind the corner. My heart skipped. An unease crept up my spine in a slow, icy crawl. I didn't know who they were, or why they had been watching me, or if I had imagined the whole thing out of fear, but something deep inside whispered that this night was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would force me to confront truths I wasn't ready to face. The fire truck arrived moments later, sirens low but lights flashing, and I watched as firefighters rushed inside with tools and meters, their professional urgency confirming that I hadn't imagined the danger. I stood on the curb, clutching my bag, the apples pressing into the thin plastic like small heartbeats, and I wondered, for the first time with terrifying clarity, whether the gas leak had truly been an accident at all. The firefighters stayed inside longer than I expected, long enough for my worry to settle into a heavy, throbbing pulse behind my ribs, and every passing minute felt like another thread unraveling inside me as I stood there, beneath the flickering street lamp, with my grocery bag weighing down my already aching arm. I watched them move through the hallways with their gas detectors, listened to the muffled footsteps echo through the stairwell, and tried to steady my breathing as the cool night air rustled against my coat and reminded me how exposed I felt out there on the sidewalk. When the lieutenant finally stepped outside, his face carried that careful neutrality emergency workers use when they know the truth will frighten someone, and my stomach tightened before he even spoke. He asked if I was the one who made the call, and I nodded, gripping the bag so tightly the plastic strained. He explained that yes, they had found a sizable gas leak in my room specifically, and that it appeared the stove valve had been loosened in a way that didn't match accidental wear. He didn't accuse anyone outright, but the implication hovered in the air between us like a cold fog, and all I could do was swallow hard and force myself to stay upright while waves of disbelief and dread washed over me. He told me the building needed to be aired out and that I couldn't return to my room for the night. He suggested staying with family or a friend, and the irony of that advice hit me so sharply I nearly laughed, because the only family I had was the daughter who needed me too much to ever truly help me, and the only friends I kept were coworkers young enough to be my grandchildren, all wrapped in their own lives. I thanked him with a voice that trembled just enough for him to tilt his head, studying me as though he sensed there was more fear inside me than I was admitting. But he didn't press, and I was grateful, because if he had pressed even a little, the truth clawing at my throat might have spilled out. After he walked away, I stood alone on the sidewalk again, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones until it felt like I'd aged another decade right there under the dim light. My mind drifted back to the figure who had been watching me earlier, the way they turned away the instant I noticed them, and although I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, the memory clung too tightly, refusing to loosen its grip. I needed somewhere to go, somewhere to sit and breathe and think, so I started walking with no clear destination, my feet carrying me through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. My joints ached with each step, a reminder of my long work hours, of how exhausted I'd been even before tonight, of how turning 69 had not given me any rest, but instead had chained me to a rhythm of labor I couldn't escape, because my daughter's needs stretched endlessly forward. When I reached the small park near the river, the benches were nearly empty, except for an older man walking his ancient dog, and I sat beneath a leafless tree while the cold seeped through my coat and into my spine. I set the grocery bag beside me, one apple bruised from the way I'd clutched it earlier, and I stared at it with an absurd sadness swelling in my chest because even that small bruise felt symbolic. Everything in my life had been dented, worn, pressed to its breaking point. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to think clearly, to piece together what I knew and what I feared. The leak was deliberate. Someone had entered my room. Someone wanted me hurt or gone. The realization wrapped around me like a tightening rope, and though part of me recoiled from the suspicion forming in my mind, another part whispered that I had ignored too many warning signs for too long. Clarice had been distant lately, more frantic than usual, asking for larger sums of money, dodging questions about where it all went. She'd stopped visiting, stopped calling unless she needed something, stopped asking how I was doing. And there was that message she accidentally sent me 2 weeks ago, the one she claimed was for a friend, the one that said, if she just lets go of the property, things will finally settle. I had dismissed it then, wanting to believe her explanation, wanting to believe my daughter would never pressure me like that. But now the memory burned through me with a clarity that left no room for denial. I buried my face in my hands as the cold wind stung my skin, and for a moment the grief inside me felt too heavy to bear. The thought of Clarice being involved, even indirectly, sliced through me with a pain deeper than any physical wound. Mothers are not built to suspect their children, and the moment they do, something fragile inside them ruptures. I wasn't ready to accept anything yet, but I also couldn't ignore what was happening. A rustle of footsteps made me look up sharply, my heart lurching, but it was only the old man passing again with his dog trailing behind, its cloudy eyes barely seeing me. I exhaled slowly, trying to untangle the knot in my stomach. I pulled out my phone and opened my message thread with Clarice. No new messages, no missed calls, just her last text from the morning before, telling me she needed to talk about something urgent. I hovered my thumb over her contact for a long moment, torn between calling her immediately or giving myself time to think, to gather strength. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to hear her voice, not when my trust was hanging by a thread. Instead, I closed the phone and placed it in my lap, staring at the dark water of the river as the streetlights reflected across its rippling surface like scattered shards. Eventually, my body grew too cold to sit still, so I stood and began walking again, unsure of where to go, but knowing I couldn't simply wander the city all night. Then, as I reached the edge of the park, I noticed a shadow detach itself from a tree, a silhouette, motionless, watching me with an intent that sent a chill up my spine deeper than the night air. I froze, unable to move, as the figure shifted lightly as though deciding whether to approach or vanish. And when they finally stepped backward into darkness, disappearing entirely, I knew beyond any lingering doubt that whatever was happening to me was no accident, no coincidence, and certainly no misunderstanding. Someone was following me, someone was waiting for something, and I was running out of time to discover the truth. I began to walk faster, hugging the edge of the sidewalk as though the narrow strip of concrete could shield me from the weight of the forest's shadow. And even though the air felt still, I kept imagining someone moving just out of sight, someone whose breath might be misting in the darkness behind me, someone whose presence I could sense but couldn't name. I didn't want to look paranoid, but my fingers curled tightly around the straps of my old canvas bag, and each time a branch snapped in the underbrush, I felt my pulse leap wildly as though my heart were trying to warn me of a danger I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. The road stretched long and empty ahead of me, brighter where the street lamps pooled their yellow light on the pavement, and I told myself that if I could just reach the diner, I would be fine, that the familiar smell of frying onions and scalding coffee would ground me, that the sound of pans clattering and customers talking would drown out the frantic thrum of my own thoughts, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It grew heavier, more insistent, like a cold hand pressing between my shoulder blades, guiding me forward or maybe pushing me towards something I wasn't supposed to escape. I dared one glance over my shoulder and saw nothing except the dark outline of cedar trees swaying gently in the night air. Yet the emptiness felt wrong, too still, as though someone had stepped out of sight just before I turned around. I swallowed hard and kept going, telling myself I was imagining it, that exhaustion after a 14-hour shift was playing tricks on my senses. But deep down, I knew my instincts had rarely been wrong, and the dread curling inside me wasn't the kind that came from imagination alone. By the time the diner's neon sign flickered into view ahead of me, its buzzing red glow bleeding into the night, my legs felt weak with relief, and I practically rushed into the alleyway beside the building, where I usually entered through the back door. The metal door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because Mr. Hallstrom always insisted it be kept locked after closing, but I pushed it gently with trembling fingers and stepped inside. The kitchen lights were off, leaving only the faint glow from the emergency exit lamp, and the shadows stretched long across the stainless steel counters, making everything look larger and more distorted. I called out softly, not wanting to startle anyone if they were there, but my voice seemed to disappear into the silence without echo, as though the room had swallowed the sound itself. That was when I noticed a faint smell, Not of food or bleach, but something metallic and sharp that made my stomach twist, and I instinctively froze in place. A scraping sound came from the far corner, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something across the floor, and I felt my mouth go dry as I strained to see through the dimness. At first I thought it might be a raccoon or a stray animal that had wandered in, but then a shadow shifted, rising upright in a way no animal would, and the silhouette of a person formed against the faint light from the exit sign. I stepped back without meaning to, my heel bumping against a rolling cart, and the soft clatter of metal utensils hitting the floor echoed loudly through the empty diner kitchen, betraying my presence before I could collect myself. The figure froze as well, and we stood locked in stillness for a breathless moment until the shape took one slow, deliberate step toward me. Panic surged through me, sharp and electric, and before the second step could follow, a voice broke through the silence, low and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop painfully. "You shouldn't be here this late," the voice said, and when the figure stepped fully into the line of light, I felt a rush of confusion and dread so tangled together I couldn't speak at first. It was Alban Rourke, one of the part-time dishwashers, a quiet young man with pale hair and a habit of avoiding eye contact, someone I had never thought twice about except to occasionally ask if he needed help carrying heavy trays. But his expression now wasn't the shy, distant look he usually wore. Instead, his eyes were wide, almost feverish, and his jaw clenched tight as though he were fighting some internal battle I couldn't see. I asked him what he was doing there, trying to sound calm even as fear prickled along my spine, and he hesitated, as though searching for a believable answer, before muttering something about checking his schedule. But we both knew the diner had closed hours ago, and no one came back at this hour unless they had a very specific reason. He glanced briefly at the alley door behind me, then at the bag in my hand, and something like frustration flashed across his face before he tried to step past me, but I blocked him without thinking, refusing to let my instincts be ignored any longer. I demanded the truth, my voice shaking, but instead of answering, he leaned in just enough for me to feel his breath against my cheek as he whispered that some people didn't know when to stop asking questions and that the night had a way of swallowing those who didn't mind their business. A chill raced down my spine at his words, and before I could respond, he pushed past me abruptly and slipped out into the alley, disappearing into the darkness as though he had never been there at all. I stood frozen in the empty kitchen, my breath trembling in my chest, realizing that whatever was happening to me wasn't just about exhaustion or paranoia. Someone was watching me. Someone knew where I slept, where I worked, and how vulnerable I truly was. And now I had proof that danger wasn't imagined. It was real, standing in front of me, speaking threats in the dim light of the diner kitchen. And I understood with frightening clarity that the gas leak in my room hadn't been the end of it, but only the beginning. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Not after Alban's words curled around my spine like cold wire. Not after watching him vanish into the darkness with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. I stayed in the diner instead, sitting in one of the vinyl booths near the front window where the street lamp cast a pale glow across the formica table. I kept replaying his voice in my head, the strange tension in his eyes, the way he spoke like someone following instructions he didn't fully understand. It didn't feel random. Nothing in my life lately felt random. Not the shadows outside my room, not the way my daughter Morel had insisted I move into the cheapest, most run-down motel she could find, not the gas leak that should have ended me if Ruth hadn't warned me. The night pressed against the windows, heavy and silent, and as I sat there with my hands curled tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee, I began to realize something I had been refusing to consider, something that felt too cruel to speak aloud. My daughter had been distant for months, colder than usual, but I had blamed it on work stress, on her husband's endless problems, on the financial issues she hinted at but never explained clearly. I had ignored the way her eyes hardened whenever I asked if she needed help, ignored the fact that she had rushed me into that motel without letting me look at other places. I had been so eager to trust her, so desperate to believe that at least one person in my life cared, that I missed every sign pointing to the truth. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to hide me, and someone had been trying to finish what the gas leak failed to do. As the first hint of dawn softened the horizon, I rose from the booth with stiff legs and walked toward the back of the diner, where the old landline phone hung on the wall near the storage room. My fingers shook as I dialed the precinct number the sergeant had given me days earlier. He answered on the third ring, sounding groggy and irritated, but when I told him what had happened, what I had witnessed, what Albin had said, his tone sharpened instantly. He told me to stay where I was, to lock the doors, that he was sending someone immediately. I hung up and did as he said, though every second felt like a lifetime. The diner felt too quiet, too exposed, and I kept imagining that someone was outside watching me through the windows. When the police finally arrived, their lights splashing red and blue across the empty streets, I felt my knees weaken from relief. The sergeant himself stepped inside, wearing his uniform and a stern expression that softened only slightly when he saw my face. I told him everything again. From the moment I stepped into the dark kitchen to the moment Albin whispered his chilling words. He listened carefully, then sent 2 officers to check the area behind the diner. Minutes later, they returned with news that made my heart slam against my ribs. Albin had been found a block away, crouched behind a dumpster with a small black notebook in his jacket. Inside, according to the officers, were pages filled with addresses, dates, and short notes in cramped handwriting. My name was written twice. My motel was listed, along with the diner and even the path I usually walked home. The officers exchanged glances as the sergeant flipped through the book, his jaw tightening. He asked me if I knew why someone would be tracking me, why someone would care this much about my routine. And I felt my breath tremble as I finally forced myself to say the words I had been avoiding. I think my daughter might be involved. The sergeant didn't react with disbelief, which somehow made everything feel even more real. He simply nodded slowly, as though he had suspected as much, and asked me to explain. So I told him about the motel, about Morel's insistence that I stay there, about the way she had stopped answering my calls after the gas leak, about the strange tension I had sensed from her long before all of this began. I told him about her financial struggles, about the inheritance she had always resented me for keeping control of, about the desperation I had seen lurking in her eyes the last time we spoke. He listened without interrupting, his expression grave. By the time I finished, I felt hollow, scraped clean of every excuse I had ever used to protect Morel in my mind. The sergeant closed the notebook and stepped back, taking a long breath before telling me that they needed to bring her in for questioning. Hearing those words nearly broke me. I knew it was the right thing. I knew I might not live long enough to regret it if I stayed silent. But she was my daughter, my only child, the nurse I had raised alone after my husband died, the girl I had worked 3 jobs for, the young woman whose birth had saved me from the loneliness of widowhood. Yet now I knew beyond doubt she had sent someone to watch me, someone to follow me, someone to finish what the gas leak started. My throat tightened painfully as the sergeant walked me out of the diner, his hand steady on my arm. Outside, the early morning breeze carried the faint smell of wet pavement as the sun slowly crept above the horizon, painting the world in fragile shades of gold. I watched the officers lead Albin into the back of the patrol car, his pale hair matted to his forehead, his expression dazed but not confused. He knew exactly what he had been doing. He looked at me only once, and in that fleeting moment, I saw no guilt, only fear. Not of me, but of whoever had sent him. And that was when it hit me with devastating clarity. Morel hadn't acted alone. Someone else had pushed her. Someone else had wanted that inheritance. Someone else had whispered in her ear until she believed her own mother was worth more dead than alive. I didn't know who, not yet, but the sergeant promised they would find out. As they drove me to a safe location arranged by the precinct, I stared out the window at the passing streets of the town I had lived in for decades, realizing I was no longer the same woman who once thought love alone could keep her safe. I was 69 years old, still working every day, still trying to survive in a world where even a child could become a stranger. But the truth was finally out, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something sharp and determined rise inside me, something that had nothing to do with fear. I wasn't going to die quietly, and whoever had tried to take my life was about to learn that I was far harder to kill than they ever imagined. Every sleepless night, every betrayal, every moment I feared I wouldn't make it through. But I did. I survived. I reclaimed my life. And I learned that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about moving forward even when fear is all you feel. I shared my story so no one else has to face the same darkness alone. If you found my story moving, if it gave you even a little bit of hope, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, because I want to see all the corners of the world my story has reached. Every single one of you matters. Every single story matters. And together we remind each other that even in the darkest moments, there's a way back to the light. Don't forget to check out the next 2 stories popping up on the screen. They're stories of survival and strength, just like this one. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for reminding me that life is worth fighting.